What I want to talk to you tonight about is, like the title says, how to argue with an atheist. I think that there are certain ground rules that should be laid down and defended, and then if you follow those ground rules and get your interlocutor, the atheist, to follow the ground rules, then I think you can have a discussion that's logical, reasonable, and one where the outcome may be somewhat surprising to the atheist. Number one, you will hear it said that not all positions are equal. One person says Q exists. The other person says Q doesn't exist. You'll be told, only the one who says Q exists owes an argument. The default position is non-existence. You can believe in non-existence unless and until someone proves to you existence. Only the one who believes that something exists owes an argument. Indeed, I've met people for whom this is almost an axiom. Now, I don't know what to do when I'm fighting with somebody else's axiom other than to provide another axiom, which I think is even more convincing. When does a person owe an argument for what he thinks? Whenever he takes a position. If you take a position and you claim it's right, you owe an argument. Whether the position starts, there is, or the position starts, there is not, makes absolutely no difference. If you are claiming that something's true about the world, then others have the right to ask you, why are you claiming that? What makes you think so? What reasons do you have for your position? If you have no reasons for your position, then you expose yourself as a kind of not serious person. It makes no difference whether you're arguing that God exists or God doesn't exist. Let's take it in ordinary examples of life where we talk about existence and non-existence. Let's talk about a viral infection. One person says he has an infection, one person says he does not. Would we follow the following path? Well, let's see. The one who says he's infected says there are viruses in his blood. That's a claim of existence. The one who says he's healthy says there are not viruses in his blood. That's a claim of non-existence. So non-existence wins by default, unless and until you have convincing evidence that there are viruses there. Would anybody do that? Of course not. Being healthy and being sick are equally claims that have to be defended. If you haven't checked his blood, there's no default position. Surely he's healthy because we haven't checked his blood. That's ridiculous. If you haven't checked his blood, the right position is, I don't know whether he's healthy or not. That's the right position. The symptoms of Ebola don't show till after a week. This person's been in the area and he's left there 3 days ago. Is he infected or isn't he? Would anybody say, well, we have no evidence, so for sure he's clean? That would be ridiculous. We would say, we haven't checked his blood, so we don't know. Let's check his blood and find out. So, a believer owes an argument that God exists. An atheist owes an argument that God doesn't exist. If we have neither, then we are agnostics, and we say, we don't know whether God exists or not. Zero argument means zero conviction. Are we together so far? Okay, now, when you have a conflict, someone believes Q, someone disbelieves Q, really, in the debate, each one owes an argument for his side. I have a recommendation that I make passionately and I believe is extremely important for clarity. Let one person do the arguing at a time, not both. Get one to agree, okay, you have a position, you're in favor of Q, you believe Q is correct, let's hear your reasons for Q. And when you respond to him, just ask, are those reasons genuine? Are those reasons valid? Do those reasons produce conviction that Q is correct? Don't argue to the other side. Just let him bear, is what we call in legal circles the burden of proof. Let him try to show that Q is correct. As this discussion proceeds, one of two outcomes can be achieved. Either he will give you adequate reason to believe Q is correct, then you accept it. Or he fails to give you adequate reasons that Q is correct, from which we draw what conclusion? We don't know whether it's correct or not. All we know is he has failed to support it. So far, I have no reason to accept it. I don't know that it's not correct. It might be correct. There might even be other reasons showing it conclusively to be correct. We just haven't found them. All we know is that he has failed to defend his claim that Q is correct. What ought to happen? What ought to happen is he ought to be demoted in his certainty. Instead of claiming Q is correct, he ought to admit that he's ignorant like the rest of us. He doesn't know whether it's correct or not. His reasons didn't work. His argument failed, so then he should reduce himself to the position of ignorance along with the rest of the crowd. His failure doesn't make me right, but it means he should reduce his certainty that he's right. He should admit that he doesn't know that he's right. Then I could try. I could try to present my arguments against Q. If I succeed, then he should change. He should acknowledge that I'm correct. If I fail, then we're both ignorant and we end up in the pile with everybody else. We just don't know what's right. That's a very important strategy, I think, because what happens often in debates like this, and not only in questions of God, somebody's trying to support his position, he puts forth his evidence, puts forth his arguments, and it's really not going too well, and there are weaknesses and certain counterexamples he didn't consider, and there are certain problems with the logic, and when he gets desperate, he says to the other guy, okay, show me wrong. That's a foul. That's a foul. That wasn't in the discussion. To defeat your certainty that you're right, we don't have to show you wrong. All we have to show is that you haven't got enough evidence to convince us that you're right. That's much easier than showing he's wrong. It's a false defense to say, I'm going to hold my position until you prove me wrong. It's illogical. If I can't support my claim that I'm right, then I ought to give up my claim. I ought to say, I don't know whether I'm right or not. That would be the honest thing to do. If I say to you, prove I'm wrong, I'm throwing up a smoke screen as if to make me give up my certainty that I'm right, you have to prove me wrong. That's incorrect. You don't have to prove me wrong. You have to do something much easier. Just show that my reasons are not good reasons. And by the way, in an American court of law, you have this in spades. A person is accused of a crime. What's the job of the prosecutor?
To prove him guilty.
Say again?
To prove him guilty.
To prove him guilty. Prove in American law means?
Without doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt. There could be a doubt, or we wouldn't call it a reasonable doubt. What's the job of the defense attorney?
Create a reasonable doubt.
To cast any doubt.
To create a reasonable doubt. That's all. The defense attorney does not have to show that he's innocent. That's not his job. Just to create a reasonable doubt. If the defense attorney wins, at the end of the trial, usually we don't know whether he's guilty or not. But I'm not sure this is true, but in American law, the two verdicts are guilty and not guilty. There's no verdict of innocent. There's a verdict of not guilty. If that means not proven guilty, I think that's great. That's exactly what it ought to mean. The prosecutor failed to prove him guilty, so he goes free. They're not symmetrical, the prosecutor and the defense attorney. One has to prove that something happened, the other has to show that the proof offered was not a good proof. That's all. I'm suggesting to set up that kind of asymmetry in the discussion. Whichever side starts, whoever starts, let him bear the burden of proof to show that he's right, and the respondent should simply examine whether his proof is a good proof or not. Now, this happens in questions of theism. When I ask an atheist to give a good argument there is no God, very quickly he sees it's not going well, as I'll show you. And then he says, well, prove there is a God. At that point, you call foul. That's a foul. To defeat you, I don't have to prove there is a God. All I have to show is you failed to prove your atheism. Then you have to give up your atheism because you have no good reason for it. This happens in values. Some people believe in absolute values and some people are relativists. So you ask a relativist to show that there aren't any real values, that all values are relative, and when he runs out of arguments, which happens very quickly, he says, well, you prove that there are values. No, that's wrong. That's wrong. If he can't show values are relative, then he's got to give up saying values are relative. He's got to give it up. I don't have to prove values are absolute to get him to give it up. I just have to show he hasn't got a good argument for his position. Then he should give up his position. He has to come over to my side, doesn't have to do that, but he has to admit his position is not defended. Okay, So my recommendation is, if a person comes across and says, I'm an atheist, because I know there is no God, put the burden of proof on him and say, okay, please show me your argument, your reason, your evidence that there is no God. Having read the literature, almost all of it is, I can show you what's wrong with all the arguments for God. That's totally irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. That's just a smokescreen. That's just passing the buck. You're telling me there is no God. What are your positive arguments that there is no God? So, for example, if we had a complete scientific explanation of the origin of the world or of the non-origin of the world and how the world works, we could explain everything that happens in detail, that would be an argument against the existence of God. That would be an argument. Of course, we haven't got that. We haven't got anything remotely resembling that. But it's the kind of thing that you would want from an atheist to produce. The argument from evil is an attempt to do the job. There's so much evil in the world, there couldn't be a God who knows everything and who has the power to run the world and is morally perfect. Okay? That's an argument. And indeed, when you face an atheist who wants to make an argument like that, so then you have to respond to it. And I will show you, tonight, a few ways to respond to that argument. But don't allow the atheist to shift the burden on you and say, well, prove there is. That's a foul. Declare that out of court and simply get him to say why he thinks there is no God. I can tell you that if you're talking to your fellow students, talking to most of your professors, if you're reading The New Atheist, the vast majority of what they write is illegally shifting the burden of proof to the other side, and therefore it's, strictly speaking, out of court. Are we together so far? If I have to convince people that God does exist, then I owe an argument. But right now we're testing whether the atheist has a position that he can defend. Now, let's take a look, briefly anyway, at the argument from evil. The argument from evil is supposed to show there is no God, the way Judaism and Christianity and Islam describe God. Of course, to say there is no God, you have to have a description, you have to know something about what it is you're talking about, its existence or non-existence. And the three features of God that are used are that God is all-knowing, and he's all-powerful, whatever those exactly mean, and he's morally perfect. And the thought is that if there is a God who's all-knowing and all-powerful and morally perfect, there shouldn't be any evil. There shouldn't be any evil. Because if he's all-knowing, he knows about it. If he's all-powerful, he could correct it or, even stronger, prevent it. And he's morally perfect, then he ought to prevent it. So it seems to follow from those three ideas about God together that there's no evil in the world. But of course, the world has in it an enormous amount of evil. And so the argument is that there can't be a God because of the existence of evil. That's called the problem of evil. Is the problem clear? It's a very old problem. You may have heard of the book of Job. The author of the book of Job was Moses. That means the book of Job is as old as the Torah is. And since then, the prophets have expressed themselves about it, and it's mentioned in the Talmud and the Midrash, and Jewish philosophers have written about the problem until the present day. So it isn't as if there isn't a large literature on the subject. Eov, that's right. Job is Eov, right. And I would say, normal way to address the problem, certainly in Jewish and in the Christian sources, which I know, I'm not sure about Islamic sources, but I would be surprised if they didn't follow suit, is to point out that some evil is deserved, let's say as a response to crime. An evil that's deserved isn't a problem. it wouldn't affect God's moral perfection if a person committed a crime and God punished him for so doing, and the punishment fit the crime, was commensurate with the crime. And some evil serves good future purpose. It's an investment in a future gain. No one complains about the loss of his capital when he invests it and earns 10% a year. And in the meantime, he can't use it for barbecues and trips to Ceylon, to Sri Lanka. He doesn't complain about that. He's earning 10% a year. So a loss that's an investment in a better return in the future is not an evil. And it can be argued that suffering that's deserved by crime on the one hand, and suffering that's an investment in the future good on the other hand, covers the whole ground. Covers the whole ground. There isn't anything left over. Or better, to put the point slightly more sharply in terms of what I've told you up until now, it can be argued that the critic can't show that it doesn't cover the whole ground. It's easy enough to see that if you take into account people's failures on the one hand, and you take into account the good effects that suffering can have on the other hand, it will be impossible for the critic to show there's leftover suffering, left over outside those two categories, left over where the person suffering is innocent and it serves no good purpose. He can't show that. And if he can't show that, then he can't press the problem of evil. To press the problem of evil, he's got to show there's evil that can't be justified. Can't be justified. When you take into account the extent of human failure, and you take into account the way in which suffering can improve a person and create good for him, it's impossible to show there's any leftover human suffering that hasn't been taken account of. And that being the case, the problem of evil can't be pressed conclusively against the existence of God. That's a standard way to respond to the problem of evil. Yeah.
So how can you, Bill, on the other hand, from our perspective, prove that suffering will equal to good? Like, I know there's some cases that it can, but other cases that it can't. And I mean, I can give examples, only two, but I'm saying, like, you know, a baby getting killed. Baby's dead now. You know, okay, fine. We believe in the world to come and so on and so forth. But talking within this realm, we can't use that as an argument because there's no evidence for that.
No. It depends upon who has the burden of proof. Again, George is accused of a crime. The prosecutor has to show he's guilty. What does the defense attorney have to do? No. He doesn't have to show he's not guilty. He has to show that the prosecutor has failed to show him guilty. That's all he has to do. It's to show the prosecutor has failed to show him guilty. If the defense attorney is successful, we may walk away and say, we don't know whether he's guilty or not.
So apply to this case.
Apply to this. I don't need evidence for my answer. I don't need evidence. All I have to show is that he has failed to press his case. To press his case, he has to show that there's suffering which is applied to people who are innocent, not guilty, and also serves no good purpose in the future. He has to show that. I don't have to show there's an alternative explanation. He has to show that there's evidence that escapes those two categories. If he can't show that, he can't press his argument. He has not succeeded in pressing an argument against God. Have I shown there is a God? That wasn't my job. My job was only to examine his argument against God. And this is the standard way of doing it. People have failures that are hard to identify. I was in a city in North America, I won't mention the city, and a woman came to me and told me a tale of psychological abuse from her husband that was really hair-raising. Hair-raising. So I said to her, why don't you go to the rabbi and ask him to start divorce proceedings? And she said, I'll tell you why, because when he walks out of the house in the morning, he's a different person. He's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. To everybody else, he's kind and friendly and sensitive and generous, understanding, happy, friendly. No one will believe me if I tell the story of what I'm suffering at his hands, or from his mouth. He wasn't beating her, but he was torturing her psychologically. No one will believe me. Now, if he's in an accident, what is the community going to say? George, An ideal person, a wonderful person, a virtuous person. How could he suffer like that? His wife knows why. She knows why. She knows why. Nobody else knows. We look at the world and we see tragedies and we say, Paul, he didn't deserve that. Do we know he didn't deserve that? There are lots of ways in which we could fail to know that he deserved that. Now, you raised the question of babies dying. It is a cardinal belief of Judaism. I'm glad you're all sitting down. You may not know this. In reincarnation. And no, we didn't get it from India. They got it from us. We're older than Indian religion. Indeed, it says Abraham, before he died, took his 6 sons that he had after Sarah died and sent them off to the east of Palestine. And he gave them certain mystical doctrines to take with them. And as one person said, I'm not sure how serious this is, but the highest caste in India is the Brahmin caste. Brahmin. Abraham. Brahm. You hear that? See? Doesn't sound like peanuts. Doesn't sound like peanut butter, or pickles. Brahm. Sounds like Abraham. Right? Anyway, reincarnation means that when the baby dies, that baby had a soul, and that soul was here before, and that soul had a very checkered career, and it may have been here 10 times before, or 20 times before, and had a checkered career, and this won't be the end of its career either. It'll be incarnated in this baby and die, and then come back again. So what you're seeing is one chapter in a biography. It's as if a person lives to 100, has a 10-chapter biography. Each chapter gets 10 pages, a 100-page book, and you read chapter 4. And you think, golly, why did that happen? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? Nothing here makes sense. Doesn't connect to anything. Sure, you read one chapter out of a 10-chapter book. So of course it doesn't make sense. So since this is a cardinal accepted belief of Judaism, and the critic can't disprove it, he can't disprove it, so he hasn't failed to make his case that the evil is beyond explanation. He hasn't made his case. Have I shown there's an alternative? No, but I don't have to show anything. I'm asking whether he can make his case. And he can't make his case. Okay, that's the problem from evil. Now, there's another type of problem, which is, and gets a similar explanation, and that is when the laws that God lays down seem to be unjust laws. Unjust, morally questionable laws about this. There's a lot of complaint in atheistic sources. The connection to atheism is, assuming that God is morally perfect, then at the very least, he couldn't be the author of these laws because these laws are not moral. And if whoever you believe in is the author of these laws, then he's not God. He's not the God we were offered. He's not the God that's on advertisement, because these laws are clearly morally deficient. Now here, there are two sorts of issues. One issue is this, and this is a crucial issue across the board. When you talk about a concrete moral judgment, what should be done in a case like this? You are relying on two foundations. One foundation is what your moral principles are. Another foundation is what you think the facts are. Two people may disagree about what the morally right thing to do is in a particular case, not because they disagree about their moral principles, but because they disagree about the facts. In that case, there's no moral disagreement. They just disagree about the facts. I'll give you some illustrations of what I mean. You are probably aware that in the ancient world, human sacrifice was very, very widespread. We read about that, and our first reaction is, these people didn't understand the value of human life. They understand how precious it is. They understand how wrong it is to kill people. How could they possibly believe in and support human sacrifice? However, you do a little more reading, a little more research, and you find out They believed that if you don't offer sacrifices to the gods, there won't be any rain. Won't be any rain. If there won't be any rain, there'll be a drought. If there's a drought, then people will die of thirst. Dying of thirst is not a pretty way to go. And many more will die than are called for in the sacrifice. So the calculation is, we're sacrificing one to save many. Now let me ask you, is that a barbarian, savage, uncivilized, uncultured point of view? Well, let's bring it up to date. Most democratic, Western, liberal, advanced societies have armies. And most of them, at times of war, have a draft. And people are drafted into the army. They don't ask for volunteers. They're drafted into the army to die to save the majority of the population. I know there are pacifists. I could argue with them also. I think that's absolutely immoral. But aside from pacifists, if you believe in the army, then you do believe in sacrificing the few to save the many. And if you happen to be a pacifist, I'd invite you to consider the following example. What about the overcrowded lifeboats? The ship goes down, the lifeboat is overcrowded, it's going to swamp. What do modern, sophisticated, educated, moral people do? They cast lots and throw a few over so as to save the rest. They're sacrificing a few to save the many. What is the difference between us and the ancients? Not the principle of sacrificing few to save the many. The difference between us and them is we don't believe that human sacrifice will change the weather patterns. We don't believe it works. But morally, they aren't so distant from us than it would appear. And that's because the real difference between us and them is a difference in a belief in the facts, not our moral principles. There is an example that anthropologists use. I'm not sure that it's real. Some people told me it is real, or whether it's just an example of cultural variations. Either way, it makes the point. There's supposedly some Eskimo groups where when parents reach a certain age, the children kill their parents. Children kill their parents. You think, they're monsters. They're monsters. Like, how can you deal with that? That's not, maybe they have arms and legs and eyes and ears, but they're not human. But then you find out that according to their beliefs, when a person dies, he goes into an eternal afterlife with the mental equipment he has at the moment of death. And they're familiar with senility. And it would be an eternal tragedy for a person to lose the sharpness of his mental faculties before he dies. So, all our modern, super liberal fellow citizens who talk about euthanasia, mercy killing, and all the rest, here it's an act of kindness to the parents who might not have the courage to make sure they have a superb eternity and don't have the courage to end their lives early enough. And the children do their parents that wonderful kindness of providing them with a superb eternity. All of a sudden, it doesn't sound so savage, so barbarian, so inhuman. Maybe there are nuances here. There are people who are against euthanasia in general. There's slippery slope arguments and so forth and so on. All right, but it's certainly within our moral discourse because it's the belief that's behind it that makes the difference. Okay, now, what are we supposed to think of laws that we regard as immoral? Well, presumably they're immoral because they have bad effects, or maybe unjust effects, or whatever. But then, maybe we don't know what the effects are. Maybe we don't know what the effects are. We don't know what the effects are. Maybe we're not equipped to determine that it's really immoral. Maybe this law that requires us to do something in a certain case, in those circumstances, is preventing something much worse, only we don't know that. After all, we're not running the world, and the world doesn't develop in haphazard terms. It doesn't develop in accidental terms, in random terms. We believe in divine providence, which means that when you act on a divine law, that fits into a structure of divine providence for running the world. The standard example, which secular philosophers give, imagine you knew that that baby was going to grow up to be Hitler. Would you strangle it in its crib? Well, most people wouldn't hesitate. Unless you're a believer in historical determinism, that the person has nothing to do with the development of history, and it's the times, and somebody else will step into the role. That's a myth that's common in some quarters. But if you don't believe that, if you believe you could stop the tragedy of the Second World War, in which 65 million people died, including 6 million Jews, you thought you could stop that by strangling one baby. Don't know about you, but I wouldn't have any hesitation in strangling one baby. But suppose nobody else knows. Only you know. So then to everybody else, it's going to look like a vicious crime. If we don't know the consequences of our actions, if we don't know the circumstances under which the actions are taking place, it's very difficult to convict the law of being immoral. That's one obstacle that's going to be very difficult for the atheist to climb over. The other is a more subtle obstacle. This one, yeah.
You give examples of halachas to match them up. Where one would say that this is immoral, and now painting the picture around and explaining why it's not.
It's a almost universal democratic value that all roles in society should be open to all people. There should be no legal restrictions on roles open to people. You develop your talents, you earn it. There's fair, open competition for roles in society, and that's the way it should be decided. But we have Kohanim, Levim, and Jews who are not a Kohen and not a Levi. No one other than a Kohen can offer sacrifices in the temple. You just can't do it. If I have to bring a sacrifice, I come to the door of the temple. Kohen says, "What do you need it done for? Have you got the right animal? Thank you. Bye! We'll take it from here." And I just have to give it over. No democratic believer is going to tolerate that. It should be open for free competition. It looks like arbitrarily restricting the opportunity of people to occupy roles in society. Now, of course, there's a factual assumption behind the democratic picture, and that is either there are no systematic differences between people, which could determine which roles are good for them, or if there are systematic differences, we can't tell what they are. We don't know what they are, and we can only discover them in open competition and experience and performance. That's a factual assumption. That's a factual assumption. So it's telling you, you don't know the truth. The truth is that a Kohen has a special kind of soul. And a Levi has a special kind of soul. And a person who's a Yisrael, who is not a Kohen or Levi, has a different kind of soul. And the soul of a Kohen is made for the role that the Torah puts for a Kohen. And the same for a Levi. So without the information that souls are different and designed for different roles, the value of the believer in democracy, I think, is quite justified. Once you put in that extra fact, it's quite unjustified. So the difference between us is not whether we believe in depriving people of opportunities and so forth and so on. What we disagree about is whether they're real opportunities or not. Whether opening the opportunity to a person is going to be bad for the person and bad for the society as a whole. Now, there's another way, another problem that you have, and is similar, and that is this. I'm not going to go into the whole issue of feminism. It's a long and complicated issue, and there's wonderful books on it if you're interested in it. I can give you a reading list. But many women who, and by the way, in our outreach programs, always the majority of participants are women, always. I don't know why some people think that feminism is such an issue and so on and so on, but we don't lack our ability to attract women because of the supposedly misogynist character of the Torah. But many people complain as follows. I see the Torah's rules for living. They don't allow me to achieve what I want to achieve. And therefore, it's prejudicial. Therefore, it's injurious. Therefore, it's unjust and unfair. Now, one of my teachers, Rabbi Meisman, pointed out there's a certain slippage of logic here. The rules of Judaism don't allow, let's say, a person to achieve Los Angeles values? Well, is that really surprising? Were the rules of Judaism designed to achieve Los Angeles values? Could you say, what poor design, what sloppy design, what lack of insight? The rules of Judaism don't achieve Los Angeles values. They weren't designed to achieve Los Angeles values. That wasn't their purpose. That wasn't their goal. Torah comes not only with a set of rules, but it comes with a set of values. You want to critique Jewish rules vis-a-vis the achievement of value? Show that Jewish rules don't achieve Jewish values. That would be an insight. That would be a piece of relevant logic. There you could say there's poor design, sloppy design, lack of realism, because they don't achieve their own values. But that Jewish rules don't achieve Los Angeles values? That's not a critique. Okay, so what can the belief in Los Angeles values say? You could say, it's just not for me. It's not for me because I believe in my values and I want to achieve my values. That's fine. There's nothing logically wrong with a position like that. But remember, we were worrying about a critique of the Jewish position. A critique of the Jewish position that the laws are not morally right. If he says, live and let live, which is what they do say in Los Angeles. You know, I do my thing, you do your thing. You're happy your way, I'm happy my way. That's fine. He's not making a critique of me. If he wants to make a critique of me on the grounds that my rules don't allow him to achieve Los Angeles values, then he'd have to show that Los Angeles values are right and my values are wrong. I suggest to you that's a tall order. It's a tall order. Morality, ethics is not in such a strong position that it's able to show conclusively matters like that for systems of values. It's an interesting subject to discuss, and there could be points here and there, but it's going to be very difficult, and the person you meet won't be able to do it. You're probably not going to meet a philosopher whose specialty is ethics and who knows enough about Jewish values to talk about them, so that's not going to be your problem. The person there, if it's a question of the values being immoral vis-a-vis his morality, that's simply an irrelevance. So again, we arrive at the result that there's no good argument for atheism. Another thing that people try to press is historical and archaeological arguments against statements that are in the Torah, other places in the Tanakh, about historical events that the Torah has described, and they want to claim that they are incorrect. I'll say a few words about that, and then I'll have some time for questions. If there are any questions, then we can quit. What do you think of the following methodology? We are going to test whether or not the Torah's view of history is true. We don't want to be biased, so we're going to put a question mark on the Torah. Is it true or isn't it true? Then we're going to use other sources of ancient history and see if the Torah agrees with them, then we have confirmation that it's true. If the Torah disagrees with them, then we have evidence that the Torah is false. That's an unbiased, fair, objective method. I don't think so. Because if the Torah disagrees with some other text of ancient history, maybe the other text is wrong. Maybe the other text is wrong. If it's going to be unbiased and fair, when they agree, then you have confirmation that they're both right. When they disagree, then you have to decide which one's more likely to be right. You don't have direct evidence that the Torah is wrong. Now I'll give you an example of the kind of consideration which can play an important role here. Ancient texts, ancient historical texts, that means writings that portrayed the history, never reported the failures of their own group. They were histories of their own group. There were no world histories in those days. The first group that started to catalog the histories of other nations were the Greeks, 1,000 years after the Torah was given. Before that, each nation kept a list of its own history, and they only kept a list of their successes, not their failures. Indeed, when you're trying to reconstruct the history of countries A and B, sometimes it reads like this. Country A has a record that it won wars and subjugated and taxed country B, at which time country B's historical records have a blank. And then 100 years later, you have country B We rebelled and threw them off, and we overcame them, and we're taxing country A, at which point country A's records have a blank. And you just melt the two blanks, and you get the picture of the countries, the two countries. Sancherib was a great general, and he conquered the whole area, except Jerusalem. We have his memoirs. His memoirs read like this: I surrounded the city, I battered down the walls, I defeated the army, and I looted the treasury. On to the next city. Surrounded the walls, surrounded the walls, battered down the walls, defeated the army, looted the treasury. Then comes his entry for Jerusalem. I surrounded the walls. I locked up the king of Judah like a bird in a cage. End of entry. No battering down the walls. No defeating the army. No looting the treasury. Just on to the next city. What happened? He lost his whole army in a night. He doesn't write that down. He wrote down what he accomplished. He locked them up in a cage. But that's all. Next city, got another army. Surrounded it, battered down the walls, defeated the army, looted the treasury. They're all the same except for this one, which he just left that part out. That's the way it goes. Now, we record our defeats in glorious detail. Military defeats, economic defeats, moral defeats, spiritual defeats, plagues, wars. Which document now carries greater reliability of truth? One that records its defeats and one that, on principle, doesn't record its defeats. Isn't it obvious that the one that records its defeats has more general credibility? So if you find a disagreement between two ancient documents and you know that this document has more credibility, the Torah has more credibility, if so, the disagreement shouldn't convince you of evidence against the Torah's reliability. Who said so? So that's not a fair argument. Secondly, this is the last point I'm going to make. This is just something you have to be aware of. Archaeologists and historians who work together use the following type of logic. The Torah says an event took place. A miracle. A miracle. The flood. Or the exodus from Egypt. A miracle. So the secular historian says, there are no miracles, period. Forget that. All right. Now the text is recording an event. Of course the text is written by these religious, naive people who believe in miracles. But let's see. Let's see whether anything really happened. Let's look for a natural event which the authors would, because of their superstitions, describe in miraculous terms. Let's look for a natural event. Let's look for the residue of a natural event. Let's look for the leave-behinds of a natural event. You don't find the leave-behinds, you don't find the residue, then the event never took place and the text is false. I hope you're catching the failure of logic here. The text didn't say it was a natural event. The text said it was a supernatural event. You, because you don't believe in miracles, create a brand new myth that there was a natural event. You look for the natural event, you don't find the natural event, then you say the text is wrong. The text never said there was a natural event. Here's the example, an example, the flood. All the secular critics want to know, where's the worldwide mud layer that's the result of a flood? There isn't a worldwide mud layer. So then the story of the flood isn't true. You see his logic? The Torah describes it as a miracle. He says there are no miracles. So the text is talking about a real event, it's got to be a natural event. If it's a natural event, natural floods leave behind mud layers. If there's no mud layers, so there's no natural event. So the text is wrong. But of course, the correct approach is the Torah was talking about a miracle. You have no reason to think that miraculous floods leave behind mud layers. How many miraculous floods have you studied after all? How many have you cataloged? 0. We don't predict that there'll be a mud layer. So the missing mud layer is no evidence against us. It's only evidence against your fantasy of a natural flood. It's irrelevant to us. You'll tell me that makes it hard to check? Too bad. Too bad. Being hard to check is no argument that it didn't happen. That's not logical either. This goes on over and over again. The exodus from Egypt. Where's the evidence of all the discarded clothes and shoes and pots and pans of 3 million people over 40 years in the desert? Well, the Torah says explicitly that their pots and pans and their clothes didn't wear out. They didn't wear out. We predict you won't find them, and you don't find them. That's bad for us. You found exactly what we predicted. No, the secular critic says, there are no miracles. Of course the clothes wore out. That's just something to glorify your ancestors. You just invented that. They wore out, and if they wore out, we should find them. We didn't find them, so it didn't happen. Excuse me? That's not a test of my text. That's not a test of my text. It's a test of your fantasy that you made up because you don't want to deal with the Torah's description of a miracle. So be very careful about that. When they offer the evidence against, that the evidence against is against what we said happened, not their myth that they made up to cast it in their presumed naturalistic context. Okay, I think you can see that there's a lot to talk about, and I haven't covered all the material. I haven't covered 30% of the material, but I think what I've covered should show you that you shouldn't be in a hurry to draw any conclusions that the atheists really have us on the run, and that they really have good, solid arguments, and they really have logic on their side. There's a lot to be said, and certainly a lot to be criticized in the attacks that people make on Jewish belief. Questions? Yeah.
It's kind of in regards to the intelligent design argument.
Yeah.
For us, in the sense that, if anybody's not familiar with it, that there's design to the world. We see that there's systems and laws and putting things in place to make it work. One of their arguments, strong when we say there's intelligent design, they say, oh, look in space and how chaotic it is. So I was wondering, what would be your response to the chaos of space?
First of all, I've read considerably in intelligent design, and I have never heard anyone talk about the chaos in space.
Really, what's his face? The guy who just passed away, he said, God isn't great. That's one of his books. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, you're talking about someone who criticizes intelligent desigin.
Yeah.
I thought you meant an argument in favor of intelligent design. So you criticize intelligent design. Okay, look, let me just lay out what I think is the correct schema here. There's an enormous amount. As a professional philosopher, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry when I read this stuff. Even supporters, the mistakes on all sides are just, they're legion. Intelligent design works like this. I see something, and I think I have a catalog of all the non-design explanations that are relevant to this thing. All the non-design explanations. And I go through them one by one, or in combinations, and I think that the non-design explanations can't account for it. That's step one. Step two, this thing is similar to other items that I know are designed. Then step three is, I have good reason to think that this was produced by design. Now, all you're concluding is you have good reason. You're not concluding that it's true for sure. You have good reason. If all the explanations that don't use design don't do the job, and this is similar to things that are produced by design, then you have good reason to think that it's done by design. Now, this isn't conclusive because, number one, your list of non-design explanations might be incomplete. There might be other ones you haven't thought of. Before 1859, evolution wasn't an option. And now evolution is an option. The point of evolution is to explain where things that look designed came from without there being design. That was the point of the exercise. So you're always open to the possibility that there'll be a new type of explanation. Stuart Kaufman of the Santa Fe Institute says that in nature there are principles of self-organization. It doesn't have any. It doesn't have any. He just says there are. Can I prove him wrong? Can I prove there aren't principles of self-organization? I can't prove that. There might be. Who knows? In the meantime, if I want to know what I have good reason to believe, I have to use the evidence that I have at hand. And if there are things which fit the conditions that I met, then I think we have good reason to believe. Now, you have to be careful with the use of the principle. For example, there was a movie about finding an obelisk on the moon. Something known? There was something like someplace else. Imagine you found a piece of metal, 60 feet tall, 20 feet square, flat top, perfectly smooth edges, perfectly perfectly smooth sides, perfectly sharp edges, perfectly. How would you explain the existence of that thing? Earthquakes? Probably not. Volcanic eruptions? Probably not. Asteroids smashing into the surface? Probably not. They're not going to produce a slab of metal like that. All the non-design explanations available for the moon ain't going to do it. Cracking and boiling of the sun and the cold of space, that's not going to do it. Now, is that similar to things that people produce by design? Sure, we produce things like that by design. Then it's appropriate to say that it was the result of design. No one denies this, except people who are so politically blinded that they can't see the tips of their fingers. After all, there was a search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Search for intelligence in space. How were they searching? Well, for example, if they got a radio beam which had in it the decimal expansion of pi, everybody agreed that would do it. Why? Because nothing in the world that we know of that's natural can produce the decimal expansion of pi, except intelligence. So you ruled out all the non-intelligence described, and it's very similar to something that is produced by intelligence. That's going to be enough to include that there's intelligence. I don't think that can be denied. I think that's absolutely obvious. And that being the case, if you can fulfill the conditions. Now, fulfilling the conditions is tricky. Each particular case, fine-tuning argument, and all the rest of them, they're tricky. But when it comes to frogs, which a certain institution wanted to make similar to the slab of metal, there I think the argument is much weaker, because we don't think we have a complete catalog of all the principles that give rise to life. We can't trace the development of life. We can't trace it in our own terms. We don't know the principles that are involved, principles of chemistry, principles of biology. They're both very, very complex subjects. 3 months ago, there was a revolution in chemistry. I don't know if you heard about it. Something totally unexpected. They're now making compounds that are chemically impossible. So, someone says, but you don't have what you even think is a list of all the non-design explanations. That's true. That makes the argument much weaker. The existence of a frog is not parallel to the existence of a slab of metal on the moon. A slab of metal on the moon is in a much more limited context where we think we know much better what forces are available to make things happen. So each case has to be discussed on its. But people who object to design arguments in principle, they're just nuts. Elliot Sober, who's a very good philosopher of science, and he actually, although he's a card-carrying atheist and believer in evolution, he's done some good critical work on evolution. He makes the classic mistake here. You can't have an inference to design unless you know the purposes of the designer, because without knowing the purpose of the designer, you can't predict what he'll do. You can't predict what he'll design next. That's simply incorrect. That's simply incorrect. There's a random killing. Will the person kill again? Is he a serial killer? Was this a warm-up? Has he gone into hiding? Has he committed suicide? The person who died with a bullet, it's intelligent design. I can't predict what he's going to do. I don't need to be able to predict the future to say it's a product of intelligence. That's unnecessary. It's one of his errors, just a prejudicial error. You don't need to be able to predict, and therefore you don't have to know what the purposes of the designer are. All you have to know is there are various things making things happen in the world that don't use design. They ain't doing it. And if they ain't doing it, then this is something that's similar to what we know is done by design. That's good reason to believe it's done by design.